being on the same time zone is super important in terms of being able to get something done. If your turnaround cycle on a bug is always going to be 48 hours, you will fundamentally be slower.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the MyDevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, dev and sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out mydevsecops.io to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company helping companies fix vulnerabilities in open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Adrian Ludwig. Adrian is the Chief Information Security Officer at Atlassian. He joined the company in May 2018 and is responsible for Atlassian's security team and practices. Prior to joining the company, Adrian held a number of leadership positions, including building out the security capabilities at Nest, Macromedia, Adobe, and Android.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we have a great guest that both delivers or sort of helps customers with making them secure, but also very much keeps their own sort of system secure at Adrian Ludwig, who is the Chief Security Officer at Atlassian. Welcome to the show, Adrian. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, Adrian, a bunch of conversations to talk about today, including kind of org structures and talking about sort of security for developers and some maybe slight contrarian views you kind of mentioned to me. Before we dig into that, you have a really interesting path into security, or maybe into security and then out and back in again. Tell us a little bit of what the role you do today, but also just kind of the path that you took to get there.
Sure. Yeah. My intro to security was a little bit of an accident. I was actually in my high school guidance counselor's office, and we got a letter saying that the NSA was willing to pay for people to go to college. And paying for college for me was a big deal. So I applied to a program and they ended up funding my education. Got a bachelor's degree in math and started learning about computers, which were, I won't say new at that time, but they certainly weren't a common thing for someone to have at home or to even be thinking about. And so I ended up working at the National Security Agency for basically almost a decade, doing a variety of different things, from cryptography to learning about very early computer exploitation and thinking through how we could protect our things that the government needed to protect, as well as how we could potentially get access to information that was being held in other people's computer systems. So really, really interesting time, and a lot of very, very smart people just kind of figuring it out at the time, which for me has been the path all along. I like working on hard problems. I like learning about new things. From NSA, I then went and did consulting for a few years, staying in the security space. And I got a little bit frustrated. Consulting is hard, right? You keep giving people recommendations, and a lot of times they're the same recommendations. And eventually said, I can't keep doing this. I need to go help somebody kind of do it right. And so I ended up at Macromedia, was the name of the company, and eventually at Adobe through acquisitions and sort of corporate change. Helped them build out their security team for a while. I ended up at one point really, really enjoying Adobe, which is great for helping designers and developers build stuff. And I ended up in a marketing role when Flash was moving towards being on mobile devices and helping figure out what that product set would look like, what features they needed, and then how to communicate with developers about what that would look like. Dallied around in marketing for a while, and then came back to security for a bit.
And what was that? What marketing role did you have? Like, it wasn't a security-minded marketing role.
No, not at all. It was, I think a lot of folks in security are a little bit frustrated because it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so for me, one way to get light at the end of the tunnel was to just look down a different tunnel. And so
that works as well,
Yeah. I went and did just straight product marketing, right? I knew how to talk with developers. I knew how to write code, which is not something that's common in somebody in a marketing role.
Yeah.
And we were trying to figure that space out. And so I just ended up working in that area for a while. It was really great, actually. Like, everybody around me was an optimist. People didn't wear black. It was a big shift, but it was cool.
I remember my career, I made the transition from security to performance and back again. So not quite marketing, but sort of in the world of performance. And it felt like that. It felt like you go to Velocity and come back and everybody kind of wants to sing Kumbaya and, kind of make the world better. And you come back from Black Hat and you kind of want to curl up in a corner and cry, it's much more adversarial and all that. So there's sometimes you need a little bit of that breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I often got, why are you so dour is how people would describe it in the marketing space. But then on the security side, it's like, why are you such an optimist? I'm like, okay, apparently I'm a centrist and the world is just, split into lots of little different fiefdoms.
Indeed. So you did this work in marketing and then you got back into security. Was that still within Adobe or?
No, I left and I got a call from Google at the time. And Rich Cannings is his name. I think he's at Facebook now. And he said, Android is coming up strong and we need to figure out security and make sure that we do it right. And that for me was really a seminal moment because for me, it was clear that mobile was an opportunity to completely reset how we thought about security. Brand new operating system, vendors of those operating systems, both Google and Apple, who were really knowledgeable about and committed to security. And so for me, it seemed like this is a great opportunity to actually do it right. That turns out to be the case. I just saw a couple days ago, Google posted that they're now paying like almost $1.5 million. I think it's $1.5 million for certain types of vulnerabilities in Android, which is insane. When I think back 20 years ago, it would take a few hours for someone to find vulnerabilities in the operating systems of that day. They certainly weren't worth $1 million.
Yeah,
and now they really are. And they're not even paying out those bounties, right? They're there, but nobody can find the stuff. So, and that's kind of why I came to Atlassian as well. I think the shift to cloud is a similar fundamental shift for companies. They've been burdened by legacy operating systems and legacy infrastructure and the data center. That just makes it really hard to keep things up to date. And I'm very optimistic that whether it be Amazon or Google or Microsoft or whatever cloud provider, that they're doing away with a lot of the complexity of managing your infrastructure. And at the application level, Atlassian certainly, but the same is true for Gmail and the same is true for, Box and Slack, like all of these different apps. They're taking away a lot of the heavy lifting that had to be done by every single company in the world. And it gets to be done by instead companies that are well capitalized and really thinking and caring about security.
I think I love the perspective, of sort of thinking about cloud as just sort of an opportunity to rethink, a lot of what we do. So in Android, though, we started, I guess, kind of from the bare bones, and sort of, you built the mobile application, was consumer oriented. And I guess there's apps that get built, but maybe I'm downplaying a little bit mobile development, but there's like a certain limit to the complexity they can run on a mobile device. In the world of cloud, it's probably not entirely true.
I'd be willing to bet the average mobile app is more complicated than the average Windows NT4 app was back in the day.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I'm not comparing it to sort of the Windows apps. I'm actually thinking as compared to like the cloud, as compared to an application that might be deployed like a SaaS, like Bitbucket Cloud, right, or sort of an application that's there that has that many more kind of moving parts. I guess, how do you see, like when you think about cloud and you think about what it allows rethinking, is it more like as a consumer? Is it like when I use, I'm just going to go on that thread of Bitbucket Cloud, you sort of help me be secure more than ever before? Or is it about Bitbucket Cloud, how Bitbucket Cloud secures itself, or like a SaaS application secures itself, that is the change?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes. Everywhere I look, I see opportunity. And I guess now I see why people think I'm overly optimistic.
Yeah.
Let's take, user authentication. Building really good risk engine to analyze your user session to determine whether or not the use of these credentials is something that's potentially been a compromised use of those credentials is not something that every company is able to do when they're thinking about authentication, right? But it is something that we have an expectation that every cloud provider is going to do. So there's like just a shift in what we think is possible there. I'll give you another example. Actually, Google just wrote up about this, which is exciting because they do a good job of branding some of their security things. They wrote about something that they're calling Beyond Prod, which, to boil it down, is basically thinking about microservices in your cloud architecture as security boundaries, which is sort of what we did with Android as well, which was taking each service running on Android and really hardening it, making sure each application is really hardened, and that those are all valid security boundaries. And then lateral movement within that operating system or between one application becomes really, really difficult. And in the cloud, what that means is we might have a bug inside of a media handling library inside of any one of our applications, whether Atlassian or anywhere else. But that shouldn't lead to compromise of all of the rest of your service. But the reason that we have chosen to decompose our app into these microservices is for performance, it's for scalability, it's for reliability, but it also accidentally almost introduced the possibility of having really strong security boundaries in lots of different places that makes what used to be a catastrophic vulnerability, everything was critical back in the day, now maybe is a much smaller scale. And that's not something that you can do on a application that's running on a single Java server running on top of Linux. That's only possible because the applications are decomposed in order to get scalability of cloud. So that's something that we're taking advantage of. We've been working on that for years now, and it's a core part of how we're thinking about security within our application. And so two different ways that security is improved, right? One is just the scale around what the expectations are in terms of user identity and managing that. And another is like the fundamental architecture of applications is becoming more robust and more secure.
I think it's a really interesting perspective. So allow me to sort of spend a few more minutes, on decomposing it. So I really like and very much relate to this idea that you can now, when you have microservices or, serverless, which I guess is kind of an extreme version of that, and you can think of each one of those as a boundary, not of just the functionality, but also of security. There's a lot of kind of counter statements a little bit to talk about the complexity, that entails, that it's kind of hard to see, the forest from the trees a little bit, right? Like what's the app? How does data flow through it? What have you are practicing or seeing as a way to kind of help navigate securing each of these perimeters, but also thinking about the whole or, not falling into that complexity trap?
Yeah, I love your forest and trees analogy. It's trite. It's probably overused, but I think it actually, maybe even unintentionally, gets at the way that the world, nature, has become more secure is smaller, individually evolving creatures, right? That all interact with one another, as opposed to homogeneous, exactly the same, all subject to crop blight sort of style of architecture that we've proposed in the past. And so I actually think that forest from trees thing, the key is that a healthy forest is one that's diverse, it's complicated, and it's one that humans haven't really been able to completely understand. But it's healthy and it's good to go. So yeah, we worry about complexity. We try to minimize it as much as we can. But at the core, we see a lot of value in having more granular security scope and being able to define each component as opposed to trying to secure the entire thing in one fell swoop.
Sounds super healthy to me, to an extent, you build those components, you can go down that rat hole of like viruses that go through forests and things like that. I'll try to avoid the temptation. So we kind of veered a little bit from sort of your journey, right now to this cloud. We might come back to this a bit as we dig into specific aspects of what you work on. Maybe let's take a bit of step away. So, you've done this journey. It included that sort of marketing piece in between, which is unusual. How much do you find those marketing skills or the muscles you built during marketing, how much, if at all, do they help you in your security work now that you're kind of back on the dark side?
I mean, there are lots of different aspects of it that are helpful. For sure, I think keeping some perspective is helpful from time to time. The world is getting better.
Staying optimist.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a big difference. I also think there's a temptation sometimes for people that come from a technical background to really want to worry about the details. And the details are important, but the details are not so important that they should preclude thinking about the big picture. And a lot of marketing ultimately is like, what's the big picture, right? I only have 5 seconds to sell somebody. How do I boil it down to that? And so that's turned out to be an important, skill I think that any executive has, that any leader has in a company. That's how you get people on board. That's how you sell security, is you make it simple and you make people feel like it's important.
Yeah, fully agreed. I mean, I think at the end of the day, kind of how do you rally people? You have to whether you're rallying your own organization or like your own security group, or you're getting other people in. So let's indeed kind of veer into that org. What does your, you run this group, what does security at Atlassian look like?
Sure. In some ways, we're pretty traditional. We have a product security team. We have a security intelligence team. One of those is basically running our security development lifecycle. The other is monitoring our infrastructure. My team broadly thinks about all types of security. And we're a big enough company at this point. We have almost 4,000 folks at several different sites. And, we have developers all over the world that are pushing code all over the world. So we have to think about what the corporate environment looks like. So we're responsible for that as well. So we're a hybrid, both product security team and corporate security team, because they're really connected in fundamental ways when you're a cloud provider. That's what we look like. We've grown a lot over the last year and will continue to grow. Atlassian is going through the transition from being primarily a provider of on-premise software to being, we are now primarily a provider of cloud software. And we think the future is all about cloud, which means that we are hosting data that is not our data, right? It's customer data. And we take very, very seriously making sure that the best possible protections are in place. And I also like to think about us adding 10 or 15 or 20 more people to do analytics and to be thoughtful about it scales incredibly well for the overall set of customers that we have. Right? Most of our customers have 0 security people looking out for their data. Probably 1% of our customers, if that, have hopes of having a security team as big or as capable as what we have at Atlassian. And so it's a very efficient way for us to add security protections to help all of our customers when they're on the cloud.
So I love the mission. What are sort of the key tenets in how you indeed sort of split it up the team, and maybe even like a little bit honing in on the dev engagement, like the rest is in the context of this podcast, just for context.
Yeah. So CorpSec, I'll sort of throw away the ones that are least relevant. Sec has responsibility for things like making sure that the laptops that are connecting to our environment, or all the computers that are connecting to our environment, are from known hardware, are the ones that we're expecting. It's tied into how we do authentication into all of our tools. So we have Zero Trust, where we're authenticating the hardware and the user. We're working on making sure that we're using YubiKey, U2F, sort of two-factor authentication to connect all of our services. That includes development pipeline, but it also includes email and Slack and all of the other sort of corporate infrastructure. Security intelligence, we have a single unified logging infrastructure across all of our corporate applications. They have all their logs flow into that infrastructure, as well as across all of the applications that we develop, right? When you use the Atlassian cloud, right? When you use Jira, events that are being created there flow into a unified logging infrastructure across all of our different apps and across our corporate apps as well. So we can correlate events that take place across all of that. That team is responsible for both making sure the logging infrastructure is working, but also writing detections on that logging infrastructure when we're seeing anomalies, whether those are localized or whether they're global. And then they also do incident response, do the follow-on investigation and after alerts are created and triggered. We've actually done some talking about how that process works. A lot of the workflow for our detection creation is tied into Jira because that's how we track stuff. That's how most companies do.
Most of the world does as well. But
So it flows into that. The product security team manages our secure development lifecycle. We have, I'll just make up a number, 30 or so discrete product teams across the company. Jira, Jira Software, Jira Service Desk, Confluence, Bitbucket, Status Page, all these different teams. Each of those areas of the company has what we call embedded engineers, which are members of the security team that are focused as consultants on that particular product area. They're familiar with everything that's going on there, new features that are coming up. They are attuned to potential risks around both the architecture of the product, but also processes. Hey, you have a release that's coming up soon. Are you going to be able to fix the security issues that have been found within that release? Or do we need to adjust the number of engineers that are working on that, or the timelines, or things like that? So we have what we call security scorecards for each of the different product areas. And on a monthly basis, review with the head of engineering and the head of product and security team how things are going, what's coming up next, and what they should be working on. We also have what we call programs, things like vulnerability management, things like threat modeling, et cetera, which are cross-cutting functions that are used by every one of the different product areas. And those are bundled up, if you will, in the security scorecard. So you can see, are these security programs being used effectively and getting the results that we're looking for? We've been investing a lot recently in finding vulnerabilities. They're everything from making sure that our scanning infrastructure scales out really well, making sure that our scanning of source code works really well, and that we're able to find things earlier and earlier in the process. And coupling that with a Jira-based workflow for making sure that all these things get fixed as quickly as possible.
I've got a whole bunch of things I want to unpack out of there. So let me hone in for a sec about the embedding process, so these teams. So you've got how many, loosely speaking, how many engineers are embedded in total? It sounds like it's, sort of 50, 60 type engineers.
Yeah, we don't have that. That's probably the end game. We're not currently at that scale yet. We're about half that in terms of the number of embedded engineers.
Are you aiming for a certain ratio? So they come in and they sort of embed in the team, which I love, and I think several other guests kind of mentioned it. It seems to be a kind of a constructive, kind of actually works type model.
Ratios are one of those things that drive me nuts. We have some basic premises that we're using to think about it right now. So one of the premises is every team should have at least one person that knows what they're doing. Right? It's not a surprise. I don't think one is enough, so we actually aim to have two. So every product area should have 2 engineers within the security team, so you have redundancy if somebody goes on vacation, if somebody's out, whatever. And that also gives the security team sort of a knowledgeable foil that you can have interactions with within the team, because we're constantly thinking about how do people rotate through their interactions with different product areas. For the most part, security engineers like to be working on a variety of different things. So we actually have our embedded engineers work on at least 2 different products. You almost always end up with 2 engineers per product, and each security engineer has at least 2 different products. Right? So you sort of end up with this overlap and interaction with a variety of different people. In terms of long-term, we have some macro level ratios that we think security shouldn't be growing more slowly than the rest of the org. Certainly not at this point. Do we think, that it's 5% of engineering or 8% of engineering or 10% of engineering? Don't know. Right sizing is probably going to be determined by results. If we start to see the amount that we're paying for vulnerabilities inside of our bug bounties going up and there being not more issues being found, that's a positive indicator that we've got a good level of investment. If we see a lot more stuff coming in and we're not able to increase our bounty rates, that's probably an indication that we're under funding preventative measures.
I love that. I was going to go back still to that process, but that's too interesting not to touch on. So you're sort of using like bug bounty rates or sort of cadences as kind of, high level, kind of, at the end of the day, bottom line, kind of how well are we doing security?
Yeah, it's a very clear indicator. It's a trailing indicator because it means you actually shipped product that has an issue in it. We would love to move further upstream, and we are. There are a bunch of intermediate metrics that we look at as well. But as a worst case, sort of end of the day metric, yeah, if you shipped it, that's an indication that, and it's sort of independent. Most other metrics on quality that I've seen that around quality of security development lifecycle, you can win those metrics by just having no engineers in your security development lifecycle, right? Nothing. You must be doing.
Yeah.
You can't win by. There's always
by doing nothing. I love that as a bottom line kind of indicators. Yeah, there was a whole kind of interesting panel in one of the recent DevSecCons talking about how it's a bittersweet moment when you find a whole bunch of vulnerabilities because it ruins your metrics, and it's it should be the other way around. But I love that as a bottom line metric. It's it might be trailing, but it definitely beats breaches. Like number of breaches is a far worse. It's more powerful, but but hopefully you don't have enough of those to warrant metrics. Back a little bit to the org though. So like you've got those, still a substantial number of them. Do you further group them by kind of product lines or are they as like how do in the security organization, how do these 30 odd people report into?
Yeah. Oh, so the security org is bigger than that. The 30 odd people are doing ProdSec and are tied into embedding. CorpSec, I guess, is one grouping, right?
I meant specifically those 30 people that are in ProdSec that are embedded. How are they further organized? I think it sounds like you have a lot of these answers kind of very well baked. I'm kind of hoping to share those with some of the rest of the audience.
I don't think we have a perfect answer to that. You want to have some level of coding, sort of technology deployment similarity tends to have patterns in terms of the types of things that you're worried about from a risk standpoint. So Atlassian, we have what we call our server products, which is the on-premise versions of our products. Those tend to be distinct from our cloud ones. They've actually got different code base at this point. They forked just a couple of years ago, but they're diverging in terms of their code base. So we do tend to have embedded engineers specialize in server versus cloud. Not that they're in competition with one another, but that distinction is an important one. Geography is a huge one, honestly. I know it sounds simple. Atlassian has folks in Sydney, Australia. We have teams in the Bay Area, teams in Austin, Texas. We have a development center in Gdansk. We have a development center in Bangalore. And so, having a personal relationship is super important for being able to be efficient about getting stuff done. Being on the same time zone is super important in terms of being able to get something done. If your turnaround cycle on a bug is always going to be 48 hours, you will fundamentally be slower. And so we've done a fair amount of geographic load balancing. Where is the dev team for that particular product based is a key thing for us to think about.
Yeah, well, those are actually really, really great metrics to sort of think about how do you group those people together. So the other thing you said is that those ProdSec people, or you said we kind of as a group work with the PMs to prioritize security work. When you think about vulnerabilities, one of the sort of the common challenges is you accumulate a backlog, and it's one thing to sort of stop creating them, but then you have a pen test or you run one of those tools, and you come up with like a lot of items. I guess how is there some methodology or thoughts or alignment in the business about how do you tackle that backlog, working with dev, and how does security versus dev kind of interact with that?
your backlog. So there's a variety of backlogs. I think we treat vulnerabilities, and I'll define vulnerability just to make sure we're all on the same page. You have a well-defined security model, and there's some exception to that security model. And it's one that would be a surprise to you and to your customer that's in there, which is different from we haven't turned on encryption yet, but everybody knows that, but we should do it sometime in the future. So we have a backlog of those types of features like encryption, which we do have now, just to be clear, but we didn't before. That is a backlog that's very long, very deep. It'll take a long time for us to get through it. On the vulnerability side, we have very strict rules. They're public in terms of how quickly we have to resolve things. It's based on CVSS scores. There's an internal number, there's an external number. I believe the external one is for 8 and 12 weeks in terms of how quickly we resolve based on critical, high, medium, low severity. So the backlog is exactly as deep as that. There's nothing in there that's longer than the duration of 12 weeks. And the team has to take action on it. And we have notifications that take place as things get closer, and we go through escalation. At any given time, there's probably a couple, of issues that are either about to breach that SLA or that have breached it. But even those get resolved fairly quickly after that point. We have to be a little bit sensitive as we introduce new scanning tools, not to completely overwhelm a team. So one thing that we do is if we're introducing a scanning tool that's finding a new class of issue, we will trial it with one area. And then we usually go through a ramping process where we first warn about critical level issues. Then once those are cleaned up and we know that those are being ingested and managed in a reasonable basis, then we'll warn about high, we'll warn about medium, we'll warn about low. So we don't ever have a large backlog or such a large backlog that a team feels overwhelmed. And that's something that we manage, sort of how we introduce those new tools so that that's not too disruptive. But ultimately, it makes a huge difference that we have an executive team and CTO that they say security is number one. And so, do you have enough issues to fix your 100 bugs? Absolutely. Or do you have enough people to fix your 100 bugs? Absolutely. There's never a question about that.
Yep.
There's a question of what does that mean you won't get done?
Yeah.
So that's a huge factor for us.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's a fundamental to sort of get things done. So I actually really love the org structure, and I'm tempted to ask a bunch more questions. But, before we started here, talked a little bit about kind of a different view. So I'll step away from the org. And we talked a little bit about, this whole world of, you talk about cloud and how we can rethink security. And you use the term consumerization of security, and talked about that a little bit about how it hasn't happened in the developer world. Like, I guess, what's your view about this, like the journey of security as a whole and what's happening to it?
Yeah, when I first started working on Android, I kept having people saying, we need, enterprise grade security. I'm like, that's the last thing we need. What we really need is security that's as good as, what we would expect for consumers. Because it tends to be the case where you don't expect the person using, the consumer to be thoughtful about security. And so you have to design your system in a way that still protects them. Somehow banks have built fairly good ways to protect money, even though the average person out there in the world doesn't think about how to protect the PIN for their banking card, a bunch of those kinds of things. So yeah, I'm a pretty big believer that simplifying security, acknowledging that developers, for example, don't care about security that much more than the average human. And the average human doesn't care about security unless it's too late. And you have to design things that way, right? So the defaults have to be secure. If it's possible to build something insecurely, it needs to be harder to do that than to build it secure by default. Those are things that we're constantly thinking about.
So I think the mental model where consumer security is actually the top tier versus enterprise security being the top tier is a fascinating one, but challenging a little bit, on the dev side, like a typical developer doesn't have as much power, the other way around. A typical consumer doesn't have as much power as a developer as it relates to the work in question. They're not building the ATM, right? They're just sort of using it. I guess how realistic, do you have a view to like the thresholds, or like, is it just aspirational, or is it something you actually get to given also the power we put in developers' hands?
I mean, I think the core of it is every time a security event takes place, do you make an assumption that documentation and training of the developer will solve the problem? Or do you say, this is a systemic mistake and I'm never going to fix people, but I can fix the environment that they're in and change something about the environment that that developer's in to make it less likely that this may happen? And I think that's like how consumer apps work, right? You fix it because you can't change people. And so that's what we have to do. And we have to say, hey, there's a buffer overflow. That library can't be available anymore. Or they're not updating their software. Or they can't turn off updates. One by one, right? The classic one, I think, in the enterprise is phishing. I know, we'll train all the people not to click on links. Really?
Yeah,
but
that's not going to happen.
Clicking on links. So, we have to do something different, right? We have to go to two-factor. We have to go to two-factor where the second factor actually validates where it's being deployed, which is what UTF does, right? UTF checks that credential is being used on that website. It's a fundamental shift, but it's one where the creators of that technology realized that they couldn't fix the people, but the pieces were all there to fix the technology.
I think it's a really good kind of mental model to just try to sort of build towards, right? Evan, as we move things around. And I guess we do have examples of this, probably like the Salesforce App Exchange might be a good example of that, which is it's a system that has been, really, really robust, despite being powerful, because they pretty much disallow anything that is risky. You have to make do.
Disallow, check for, make sure responsibility is very well understood by those developers. There's a lot of elements to that. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd like to bring it back a little bit to this notion of cloud. So we have this philosophy and we have the team structure. I want to talk a little bit about cloud security, right? And I'll kind of posit that in the world of cloud, above and beyond microservices, what also happened is that, a lot of responsibility went from maybe more of an IT stack. I mean, yes, the infrastructure itself went to the IS vendor, but then a lot of the rest of it went from maybe some central IT team into the hands of the developers. You might be provisioning containers or network configurations and the likes, and you put that at the hand of developers. So looking at kind of the simplification, this might go the other way around in terms of giving you less ways to shoot yourself in the foot. How do you tackle that when you think, do you have a dedicated cloud security team, especially like you're talking about moving, or you've now moved to being primarily cloud? What's your approach to cloud security as a whole?
Yeah. It's a fun one. I always came from a product world. I worked on Flash, I worked on Android, I worked on browsers, those kinds of things. So I never had to deal with the non-cloud world. But I hear it's really hard to secure because you can't find it. It's like there's a server under somebody's desk. Who's managing that? Who's keeping it up to date? And one of the things that we get in cloud is a pretty good understanding of what we have. Atlassian has a fairly consistent, pretty well managed both corporate and product infrastructure because it's all in cloud. And so we have a pretty good inventory of it, a good understanding of what's there. And that's quite different from other places. It is originating from developers, right? They say, I need a new instance. Boom, they have a new instance. But we've done quite a bit to add platform as a service capabilities and make it easier for developers to add new things by using that platform as a service. And there's a bunch of security services that are tied into that platform as a service that give us the ability to do monitoring, that give us the ability to have visibility to what's going on in that environment. But the reason that developers use that is because they also get a bunch of benefits, right? They get tools for debugging, they get tools for tracing, they get a whole bunch of scaling infrastructure that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so you kind of have to couple those security benefits with the developer benefits, and then it's just harder for them to use non-platform stuff, is what it comes down to.
So it's kind of that sort of the paved path approach of sorts. You give them these options, but you allow them to go off road. You sort of allow them to go the other paths. They just need to jump through more hoops.
They can.
I'm mixing my analogies here.
Okay. Yeah, we don't prohibit it. We do have constraints around if you want to have customer data inside your service, then it has to meet these minimum requirements around security, privacy, compliance, etc. And sure, if you can provide all the infrastructure that's being provided by the platform, by all means, knock yourself out. But it turns out it's actually pretty hard to do that. And so we tend to see experiments. We tend to see people, building totally new things, but integrating into our existing apps, not quite as much on completely new infrastructure.
So I have a whole bunch more questions, but I think we're already kind of going along a little bit with the episode. So I'll ask you, what I like to ask every guest on the show, which is if you have one bit of advice, right? It could be a pet peeve or something that sort of annoys you that people do, or just like, what do you think is the best kind of eureka moment for a team looking to level up their security foo? What would that be?
Yeah. I think for a long time, security teams were seen as blockers. And what I've started to see is now security teams that really don't want to be seen as a blocker. And so they end up being an enabler. And by that, I mean, the person that would give you alcohol at a party, even though they knew you had too many to drink. Or pick your substance of choice. And I think that finding that fine line and making sure you don't fall into either of those two traps is really, really hard to do, but it's something that you got to find. And so I would say look for that line where somebody will come to you and ask for help because they know they need help. And that's what I see time and time again is like engineers that are building product, they know they don't know security. They want you to help them. Now they'll push back. They'll say, oh, do I have to fix that? And the answer is yeah. You do. You got to fix it and you got to do it now. And then we got to talk about how to avoid it in the future. And I'm here to help you do that, but I'm not here to say it's okay. And that's a tough thing to do. But if you do it well, all of a sudden security becomes a lot less painful. That's what I would aim for, is trying to find that balance.
That's great advice. I just sort of add that, like, I think a lot of the thoughts and the concepts and how you model it and how you explain it does imply that maybe another bit of advice is to spend a couple of months in marketing. I think that that might help it. Adrian, this was a pleasure. Thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Thanks. I had a great time chatting with you. Thank you.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. For additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit mydevsecops.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, you can also find us on Twitter at @mydevsecops. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.